The procedure was scheduled for 6 in the morning. At 5:47, Crispinia Valletta Harrow walked through the door of a room she had no authorization to enter, carrying a folder of handwritten notes that no one had asked for, and placed herself between a 9-year-old boy and a decision that 7 doctors had already signed off on. She was a cleaning woman, and she was the only person in that building who had figured out what was actually killing him. 3 months earlier, Crispinia had not yet heard the name Balthazar Quinley Rourke. She had other things to think about. Her alarm went off at 4:15 every morning, not because she needed that much time to get ready, but because the bus that connected her neighborhood in Cicero to the hospital's service entrance arrived at 5:02, and if she missed it, the next one came at 5:44, which meant clocking in late, which meant a conversation with the floor supervisor, which meant the kind of attention she had learned over years to avoid entirely. Crispinia was 34 years old. She was the daughter of Guatemalan immigrants who had spent the better part of their lives working jobs that made other people's lives cleaner, quieter, and more comfortable without ever being truly seen while doing it. Her mother had cleaned offices. Her father had worked in a commercial laundry until his back gave out. They had both passed within 2 years of each other, leaving Crispinia with a small amount of debt, a younger sister named Dulcie, who was finishing her last year of high school, and a very clear understanding of how the world was structured and where she stood inside of it. She did not have a college degree. She had tried community college for 1 semester, but the schedule had conflicted with the only shift available at the time. And the shift paid rent, and rent was not optional. She told herself she would go back. That was 6 years ago. She had not gone back. What she had instead was a kind of intelligence that does not appear on any resume and is rarely recognized as intelligence at all. She noticed things. Small things. The kind of details that most people filter out as background noise because their brains have decided those details are not important enough to store. Crispinia's brain did not make that decision easily. It held on to patterns. It cross-referenced without being asked. It filed information away and retrieved it at unexpected moments, making quiet connections between things that seemed, on the surface, completely unrelated. At the hospital, this quality made her exceptionally good at her job and almost entirely invisible at the same time. She knew which hallways got the most foot traffic between 2 and 4 in the morning and planned her route accordingly. She knew which supply closets were stocked inconsistently and learned to compensate without asking anyone for help. She knew the names of the nurses who actually read the cleaning logs versus the ones who signed off without looking, and she knew the difference between a room that needed a standard turn and one where something had gone wrong the night before, just by the way the air felt when she opened the door. None of this was written in her job description. None of it was acknowledged by her supervisors. It simply existed quietly as part of how she moved through the world. Her shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. She preferred nights. The hospital was different at night, slower, dimmer, more honest somehow. During the day, everyone performed their roles with a kind of heightened awareness, conscious of being observed. At night, the performance relaxed. Doctors spoke more candidly in the hallways. Nurses sat at their stations with their shoulders down. The building exhaled. Crispinia moved through it like she always had, steadily, efficiently, and without drawing attention to herself. That was how she first noticed the boy. It was a Tuesday in late October when she pushed her cart past room 412 and heard something that made her slow down without meaning to. It was not a cry. It was quieter than that. A small, strained sound, the kind a child makes when they are trying very hard, not to make any sound at all. Crispinia paused outside the door. Through the narrow vertical window, she could see the outline of a hospital bed, the blue glow of a monitoring screen, and a small figure lying very still beneath a white blanket. She did not go in. It was not her room for another. 40 minutes, and she had learned a long time ago that entering a patient's room outside of her scheduled time was the kind of thing that generated questions she preferred not to answer. But she slowed down, and she looked, and she noticed. The IV line on the left side of the bed was positioned, slightly differently than it had been the last time she cleaned that room, 3 nights ago. The tray table had been pushed to the far corner, which was unusual. Families typically kept it close. And on the windowsill, nearly hidden behind the curtain, There was a small cloth bag that had not been there before. She filed these things away without analyzing them. That was simply what her mind did. It was not, at that moment, a decision. It was a reflex. She continued down the hall. By the end of that same week, she knew his name. Not because anyone told her. The hospital staff did not generally introduce patients to cleaning personnel by name, but names appear in many places that are not medical charts, on flower arrangements left by visitors, on the covers of cards that miss the trash can, on the lips of nurses speaking in lowered voices that are not quite low enough. Balthazar. She thought it was an unusual name for a child. She thought about it briefly, and then set it aside. What she did not set aside was what she had begun to observe. By the 3rd week of November, Crispinia had cleaned room 412 17 times. She had not counted intentionally. The number simply existed in her mind the way all numbers did, attached to context, retrievable on demand. And across those 17 visits, she had begun to notice a rhythm that did not align with what she understood, from years of working in that building, to be the normal rhythm of patient care. The medication schedule, visible to her only in fragments, through overheard conversations and the indirect evidence of packaging left near the waste bin, seemed to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would appear on a chart as an obvious discrepancy, but the timing was inconsistent in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. A Thursday that looked like a Tuesday. A gap where there should not have been a gap. The dietary tray, which she cleared 3 times a week, showed patterns she could not fully explain. Certain items left untouched in ways that did not match what the nurses described as the boy's appetite. Wrappers occasionally, for things that were not on any hospital menu she recognized. And the small cloth bag on the windowsill. It appeared and disappeared. Sometimes it was there, sometimes it was not. She never touched it. She never opened it. She simply noted each time, whether it was present or absent, and she noted what days the boy seemed worse on the mornings after it had been there. She told herself she was imagining a pattern where none existed. She told herself this several times. Her mind did not accept the reassurance. It kept returning. To the numbers, the timing, the small cloth bag, and the face of a man she had seen twice in that corridor after midnight, speaking to no one, staying longer than visiting hours permitted. She had seen his photograph in the lobby. Eldrick Rourke. The name was on a plaque near the administrative wing, above the words, Platinum Benefactor. He was a tall man, with an expensive coat, and the particular expression of someone who had spent decades being told that the rules were suggestions written for other people. He was also, she understood from fragments of overheard conversation, the boy's father. Crispinia pushed her cart to the end of the hallway and stood for a moment at the window that overlooked the hospital's rear parking lot. The Chicago winter was settling in, slow and gray, pressing against the glass. Below, a few cars sat under the orange glow of the lot lights. Nothing moved. She thought about Dulcie, who had a scholarship interview in 2 weeks and needed new clothes for it, which they could not quite afford. She thought about the electric bill that had come in higher than expected. She thought about all the reasons why the smartest thing she could do was to continue doing her job exactly as she was supposed to do it, and to let the doctors and nurses and specialists and administrators handle the things that were theirs to handle. She thought about the small sound she had heard through the door of room 412, the sound of a child trying very hard not to be heard. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket. It was a plain composition notebook, the kind sold in packs of 3 at the dollar store. She had been using it for grocery lists and budget calculations and Dulcie's school schedule. She opened it to a blank page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below, she wrote what she had seen, in the careful, economical handwriting of someone who had learned to make words take up as little space as possible. She did not know, standing there in the dim hallway with the winter pressing at the window, that the notebook would end up in the hands of a young resident named Orenthal Pike Mercer at 5:47 in the morning, and that what she had written in it would change the course of what happened next. She only knew that the pattern was real, and that no one else in that entire building seemed to have noticed it yet. The notebook grew heavier with every passing night. Not physically. It was still the same cheap composition notebook from the dollar store, its cover slightly bent at the corner from being folded into her jacket pocket too many times. But Crispinia felt its weight differently now. It was no longer just a place where she wrote grocery lists and tracked Dulcie's school deadlines. It had become something else, something that made her chest feel tight when she thought about it too long, and her hands feel restless when she was not writing in it. By the second week of December, she had filled 11 pages. 11 pages of dates, times, observations, and quiet questions that she did not know how to answer, but could not stop asking. The kind of questions that, once they take root in a mind like hers, do not let go simply because the practical, reasonable part of her tells them to. She had organized the entries without intending to organize them. It had simply happened, the way organization always happened for her. Naturally, almost involuntarily, the way water finds the lowest point in a room without being directed there. Each entry noted the date, the time she had been in or near, room 412, what she had observed, and any detail that struck her as inconsistent with what she had seen on a previous visit. She had begun adding a small symbol in the margin, nothing elaborate, just a tiny asterisk, next to entries that connected to other entries. By the second week of December, the asterisks had started connecting to each other in ways she could not ignore. The cloth bag on the windowsill had been present on 9 specific nights. On 8 of those 9 mornings, the nursing staff had noted in their hallway conversations Crispinia was present for in the way. Furniture is present, noticed only when moved, that Balthazar had had a difficult night, restless, nauseous, his numbers off in ways that the team attributed to the progression of whatever was wrong with him, which no one seemed to have agreed on yet, despite 7 specialists and weeks of testing. One night the bag had been there and the morning had been unremarkable. She had circled that entry and stared at it for a long time, turning it over in her mind. An outlier. A variable she could not account for. Her mind chewed on it for 3 days before she noticed something she had overlooked. That particular night, the boy's father had left earlier than usual, well before midnight, according to her own notes on when she had seen him in the corridor. Whatever was in the bag, if the bag was even connected to anything at all, had perhaps not been used that night. She was careful, in her private thinking, to apply constant pressure to her own conclusions. She was not a doctor. She was not a nurse. She had no medical training beyond a first aid certification she had completed 6 years ago, as a requirement for a different job she had ultimately not been hired for. She did not know what was in the bag. She did not know the boy's full medical history. She was working from fragments, overheard words, visual details, patterns of timing, and she knew, with the clear-eyed honesty that had always been one of her defining qualities, that fragments could mislead. That pattern, recognition, which was her greatest strength, was also capable of manufacturing connections that did not exist. She tested herself constantly. She looked for alternative explanations. She asked herself each time she added an asterisk whether she was seeing what was actually there or whether she was constructing a story around something that had a far simpler explanation. But the simpler explanation kept failing to hold. The first time she tried to say something, it did not go the way she had imagined. She had imagined it several times before doing it, running the conversation through her mind the way she ran everything through her mind, carefully, accounting for variables, trying to anticipate the response. She had decided that the right person to speak to was not a senior nurse or a supervisor. Those were people with too much invested in the existing structure, too many reasons to hear what she was saying as a problem rather than as information. She chose instead a younger nurse named Perla Oduya, who had been working the pediatric floor for about 8 months, and who struck Crispinia as someone who still had enough freshness in her to be curious rather than defensive. Perla was professional and calm, and on 2 separate occasions Crispinia had observed her take extra time with patients in ways that went slightly beyond what was required. Adjusting a pillow without being asked, sitting for an extra few minutes with a child who was having trouble settling. Small things. But the kind of small things that Crispinia noticed, and that told her something about a person's character. She waited until a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m, when the floor was quiet and Perla was at the nursing station alone, catching up on paperwork. Crispinia came from the supply room and slowed her cart near the station, keeping her voice low and her tone as neutral as she could manage. "Nurse Oduya," she said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I've noticed something, and I wasn't sure who to mention it to." Perla looked up. Her expression was not unfriendly. "What is it?" Crispinia had rehearsed this. She kept it simple, clinical in tone, free of anything that sounded like accusation. She mentioned the timing inconsistencies she had observed, the way the boys' difficult nights seemed to correspond with specific visit patterns. She did not mention the cloth bag, directly because she was not certain enough about it, and because she did not want the entire conversation to collapse around one detail she could not fully explain. She mentioned only the timing, only the pattern. Perla listened. Crispinia could see her processing it, could see the slight shift behind her eyes that meant she was deciding how to categorize what she was hearing. "You've been paying attention to when his father visits," Perla said. Her voice was careful. Not cold, but careful. "I've been paying attention to the timing of difficult nights relative to visit patterns," Crispinia said. "I wasn't sure if it was something anyone had already looked at." There was a pause. "The team reviews his chart every morning," Perla said. "Every fluctuation is tracked. The specialists have access to all of that." Another pause. "I appreciate you saying something. I do. But the clinical picture is really complex, and there are a lot of factors that, it's not the kind of thing that a timing observation from outside the care team would necessarily—" She stopped herself, rerouted. "I'll mention it to the charge nurse, okay? Don't worry." Crispinia nodded. "Thank you." She pushed her cart back down the hallway and did not look back. She knew, with a certainty that settled over her like cold weather, that Perla Oduya would not mention it to the charge nurse. She was right. 3 days passed. Nothing changed. Balthazar had another difficult night. She heard about it. The way she always heard about things, through the ambient information of a hallway she was supposed to be cleaning and not listening to. The team was concerned. The specialist from Northwestern had been called. The father was demanding a meeting with the chief of medicine. Crispinia added an entry to the notebook. She went home on the morning bus, sat next to a man who fell asleep on her shoulder somewhere around the 3rd stop, gently redirected him without waking him, and stared out the window at the gray Chicago sky until her stop came. Dulcie was already awake when she got home, sitting at the kitchen table with her scholarship application spread out in front of her. She was 17 and brilliant, and far more naturally suited to formal academia than Crispinia had ever been, and watching her work was one of the few things that could, on a hard morning, cut through the weight that Crispinia carried everywhere. "How was it?" Dulcie asked without looking up. "Quiet," Crispinia said, which was what she almost always said. She made coffee, changed out of her uniform, and lay down on top of the covers without bothering to get underneath them. She meant to sleep for a few hours before the afternoon, which was when she usually handled errands and bills and the ongoing arithmetic of making the numbers work. Instead, she lay with her eyes open and thought about a 9-year-old boy in a room on the 4th floor and a cloth bag on a windowsill and a pattern that kept holding no matter how many times she tried to find the crack in it. She thought about what it would mean to be wrong, and then she thought about what it would mean to be right and to have said nothing. The second time she tried, it went worse. She approached a different person, a charge nurse named Dwayne. Ferris, who had been on the floor for 11 years and who had, from what Crispinia had observed, the kind of authority that came not from his official title, but from the simple fact that everyone around him had learned to defer to his judgment. He was not unkind. He was simply certain, in the way that experienced people in institutional settings sometimes become certain. Not arrogantly, but completely. The world for Dwayne Ferris had a clear structure. Things worked a particular way because they had been tested and found to work that way. Deviation from the structure was not innovation. It was noise. Crispinia approached him near the end of her shift, around 5 in the morning, when the floor was beginning its slow transition toward the day team. She was more direct this time. She had her notebook with her. She did not open it, but she held it, and she walked him through the pattern. More specifically than she had with Perla. The dates, the timing, the correlation between visit nights and difficult mornings. Dwayne Ferris let her finish. That, she would later think, was genuinely more than she had expected from him. Then he said, "How long have you been at this hospital?" 3 years, she said. "And in those 3 years," he said, still in the same measured, not unkind tone, "have you had any clinical training? Any medical background?" "No," she said. "I know I don't. I'm not trying to diagnose anything. I'm just—" "You're presenting a theory," he said, "about a patient's care, based on observations you've made while cleaning rooms." He said it plainly, without visible contempt, which almost made it worse. "Do you understand the kind of position that puts this floor in? That puts you in?" "I understand that I might be wrong," she said. "I'm not saying I'm not. I'm saying that the pattern is there and I thought someone should know about it." "Someone does know about it," Dwayne said. 7 specialists know about this case. The attending physician knows. The chief of medicine is involved. The family has access to some of the best medical minds in this city." He paused. "I hear that you're concerned. That's not a bad thing. But this is not how this works. If you have concerns about hospital operations, there's a proper channel. You can speak to your floor supervisor. What you cannot do is involve yourself in a patient's clinical situation. That's not your role. Do you understand?" She said she understood. She did understand. That was the most exhausting part. He was not wrong about the structure. He was only wrong about whether the structure was working. She filed into a bathroom near the supply corridor after that conversation and stood for a moment with the water running, not washing her hands, just running the water, for the noise of it. She looked at herself in the mirror. The overhead light was the unflattering kind that hospitals favor in non-patient areas, the kind that makes everyone look like they have not slept, which in her case was simply accurate. She thought about stopping, about closing the notebook, tucking it into her bag, and letting it be the thing it was supposed to be. A dollar store composition book filled with grocery lists and Dulcie's deadlines and nothing more. She thought about it for a long time. Then, she turned the water off, dried her hands, and walked back out into the hallway. The notebook stayed in her pocket. She began researching. She did not have access to medical databases or clinical literature, but she had access to the public library on Saturday afternoons, when her shift did not start until 10, and she had access to the particular quality of focused attention that had always been her greatest resource. She read about pediatric medication interactions. She read about the kinds of supplements that were commonly used outside of conventional medicine by families who had money, and the particular kind of anxiety that money sometimes generates. The sense that conventional answers are never quite enough, that there must be something additional, something exclusive, something that the regular doctors are not offering. She read about a category of interactions that occurred, not because a medication was wrong on its own, but because something else, something not in the official chart, not administered by hospital staff, not accounted for in any clinical calculation, was being introduced alongside it, something that, on its own, would seem harmless. Something that a father who believed he was helping his son might bring in a small cloth bag and administer during a private visit, without telling anyone, because he did not think of it as medication, because it was natural, because someone had told him it would help. She read until the library closed. On the bus, home, she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote one sentence at the top. What if the problem isn't what they're giving him, but what they don't know they're giving him? She underlined it. Twice. Outside the window, Chicago moved past in the dark, indifferent and enormous, full of people who were each carrying something that no one else could see. She held the notebook against her chest for the rest of the ride home. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as turning points while they are happening. They arrive dressed as ordinary nights, as regular shifts, regular hallways, regular sounds. The cartwheels making their familiar sound against the linoleum floor. The overhead lights, at their usual dim nighttime setting. The smell of industrial cleaner and recycled air that Crispinia had stopped consciously registering somewhere in her second year at the hospital. The way you stop hearing the sound of traffic when you live near a busy street long enough. It was a Wednesday night, in the second week of December, when everything changed, and it changed the way significant things often do in real life. Not with drama or noise, but with a detail so small that most people would have walked past it without breaking stride. Crispinia did not walk past it. She had been assigned to the fourth-floor supply audit that night, which meant she would be working closer to room 412 than her usual rotation allowed. The supply audit was tedious work, counting, cataloging, checking expiration dates on items that the day staff rarely thought about until something was missing. It required her to move between the main supply room and several of the smaller storage closets distributed along the corridor, which meant she was passing the door of room 412 more frequently than usual, and at intervals that were less predictable than her normal schedule. It was on her third pass, at approximately 1:15 in the morning, that she saw Eldrick Rourke in the hallway. This was not unusual on its own. She had seen him before, late at night, when visiting hours had technically ended, but the hospital's willingness to enforce that rule with a platinum benefactor was, in her observation, flexible in direct proportion to the size of his name on the donation plaque. What was unusual was that he was not going into the room. He was coming out of it, and he was moving quickly. Not running, but with the compressed, deliberate stride of someone who does not want to be seen moving quickly. He passed her without making eye contact. Crispinia had long ago perfected the particular quality of stillness that made her invisible in moments like this. The slight angle of the body, the downward orientation of attention, the appearance of total absorption in whatever task was at hand. She was counting items on a shelf when he passed. She did not look up. She registered everything. He was carrying the cloth bag. Not on the windowsill. Not left behind. He was taking it with him, the strap gathered tightly in his right hand, the bag pressed close to his body in the way people carry things. They do not want noticed. His coat was already on, which meant he had put it on inside the room rather than in the hallway, which meant he had been preparing to leave before he opened the door. He was at the elevator before she had finished counting to 10. Crispinia stood very still for a moment, after the elevator doors closed. Then she walked to the door of room 412 and looked through the narrow window. Balthazar was awake. That was the first thing she noticed. Not that he was distressed, not that anything was visibly wrong, but simply that he was awake at 1:15 in the morning, sitting, slightly upright against his pillow, his eyes open and directed toward the ceiling with the particular unfocused quality of a child who is not quite present in the room they are physically occupying. He was 9 years old, and he looked, from where Crispinia stood on the other side of the glass, like someone who was very tired in a way that sleep was not fixing. She noted the time in her notebook. She noted that Eldrick Rourke had been in the room and had left carrying the bag. She noted that the boy was awake. Then she went back to her supply audit, because there was nothing else she could do at that moment, and because the audit was her job, and because she had already been told twice that the clinical situation was not her concern, and the words of Dwayne Ferris were still sitting in her chest like a stone she had swallowed and could not digest. By 4 in the morning, Balthazar had been attended to by 2 nurses in rapid succession. She heard them from the hallway. His numbers had shifted. Nothing critical, not yet, but enough to require attention, enough to generate the particular quality of controlled urgency that experienced medical staff produce when something is wrong, but not yet an emergency. She added 3 asterisks to that night's entry, the most she had ever used for a single entry. The next morning, she did not go home immediately after her shift. She sat in the small, underfurnished waiting area near the hospital's main entrance for 45 minutes, watching the day shift arrive, watching the building shift from its nighttime self to its daytime self, and thinking about the library research she had done the previous Saturday. She had gone back a second time, the Saturday after the first. She had been more focused during the second visit, more targeted in what she was looking for, because the first visit had given her enough of a framework to know which direction to go. She had read about a specific category of herbal supplements, products that were legal, widely available, marketed aggressively to wealthy consumers as immune system support, as cognitive enhancers, as the kind of thing that responsible, proactive parents gave their children when conventional medicine seemed to be failing them. Products that interacted, in certain combinations and at certain dosages, with specific classes of medication in ways that were not always well understood even by clinicians, because the research on pediatric interactions in particular was incomplete, and because the supplements were not required to be disclosed unless the patient or family volunteered the information. She had found 3 specific products that matched a pattern. She had constructed from fragments, from the wrapper she had seen near the waste bin once, from the description of the cloth bag's contents that she had glimpsed only briefly through an accidentally wide-open door one night before, quickly redirecting her attention, from the timing and nature of Balthazar's fluctuations as she understood them from what she had overheard. She was not certain. She was still not certain. But the shape of what she suspected had become, over those 2 Saturday afternoons in the public library, something more than intuition. It had acquired structure. It had acquired logic. It had acquired the particular quality of a theory that keeps finding evidence to support it no matter how hard you push against it from the other side. She sat in the waiting area with her coat on and her bag in her lap and thought about what she was going to do with that. A man walked past her carrying a coffee and a newspaper. A family came through the main doors, moving quickly, their faces carrying that particular hospital entrance expression. Braced, tight, preparing for something. A janitor from the day shift, a man she knew by sight but not by name, pushed a cart through the lobby without looking up. She thought about Dulcie, who had her scholarship interview in 10 days. She thought about the electric bill. She thought about the conversation with Dwayne Ferris, and the way he had been so reasonable and so completely wrong at the same time. She thought about a 9-year-old boy sitting awake in the dark at 1:15 in the morning, looking at the ceiling with eyes that were too tired for a child his age. She got up, walked to the bus stop, and went home. But before she slept, she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and spent 2 hours reorganizing everything she had written into a single coherent sequence. Dates in one column, observations in a second, connections in a third. She drew a simple timeline along the bottom of one page, marking every difficult night she had recorded against every visit she had noted that included the cloth bag. The correlation was not perfect. It was not the kind of clean, straight-line correlation that would satisfy a statistician, but it was consistent enough, and consistent in a direction that only pointed one way. She stared at it for a long time. Then she wrote at the bottom of the page, in letters slightly larger than her usual careful handwriting, "The procedure is in 8 days." She had overheard that from a conversation between 2 nurses near the medication room. An interventional procedure, the details of which she did not fully understand, but which she understood. To be significant, to be the kind of decision that represented a last resort after other approaches had not produced the needed results. The kind of procedure that carried its own risks, that required the patient to be in the most stable condition possible, and that would address the symptoms that the team had identified without necessarily addressing whatever was causing them. She underlined the sentence. 8 days. She slept for 4 hours. She woke up, made coffee, and called her cousin Marta, who worked as a medical records clerk at a different hospital across the city, and who was, of all the people Crispinia knew, the most likely to be able to help her understand something she could not look up in a public library. She did not tell Marta everything. She framed it carefully, describing a hypothetical situation, a child on long-term medication, a family using supplements outside of the official treatment plan, a cluster of symptoms that the clinical team was attributing to disease progression. She asked Marta whether that kind of interaction, supplement to medication, was something that would necessarily show up in routine lab work. Marta was quiet for a moment. "Depends on what they're testing for," she said. "If nobody told them to look for it, they're probably not looking for it. You'd need a specific tox panel, and you only order a specific tox panel if you already suspect something. And if nobody suspects it, then they don't order it," Marta said. "And it doesn't show up." Another pause. "This is a hypothetical?" "Yes," Crispinia said. Marta made a sound that was not quite agreement. "Okay," she said. "Well, hypothetically, if someone had that information and it was accurate, the right thing would be to get it to someone who could order the right test, not a nurse, a physician, someone with authority to change the testing protocol. And if the person with the information isn't a physician, then they'd need to find one who would listen to them," Marta said, "which is easier said than done." She paused again. "Take care of yourself, Chris." "I always do," Crispinia said, which was not entirely true but was the kind of thing she said reflexively, the way you maintain certain fictions to protect the people who love you from worrying too much. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Find one who would listen. She thought about who that might be. She had observed the residents the way she observed everything, quietly, over time, building a picture from accumulated detail rather than from any single interaction. The fourth floor saw a rotation of residents throughout the year, and Crispinia had developed, without particularly intending to, a working understanding of each of them, their habits, their schedules, the way they moved through the floor, the quality of attention they brought to their work. Most of them were what she would have expected, competent, under-rested, operating within the framework they had been given, their individual instincts increasingly subsumed beneath the institutional culture of the hospital. Some of them had arrived with visible fire, with the particular brightness of people who had chosen medicine because they genuinely believed they could make a difference. And she had watched that fire dim over months, not extinguished but turned down, adjusted to a level that was sustainable within the existing structure. One of them was different. His name was Orenthal Pike Mercer. She knew his name because it was embroidered on his white coat, and because she had a mind that retained names the way a ledger retains figures, automatically, without requiring a decision to remember. He was young, she estimated late 20s, though he carried himself with the intermittent uncertainty of someone who had not yet decided whether he trusted his own judgment, and he had been on the rotation for approximately 4 months. What she had noticed about him was not dramatic. It was a collection of small things. The fact that he asked questions at handover that other residents did not ask. Not more questions, but different ones directed toward corners of the picture that the presenting nurse had not specifically highlighted. The fact that she had seen him, twice, return to a patient's room after completing his official rounds, apparently because something had occurred to him after the fact. The fact that he read chart notes with his forehead slightly furrowed, the expression of someone who is reading critically rather than just gathering information. She had also noticed that he had not been on the Rourke case. Whether by assignment or by deliberate distance, the case had the kind of high-profile, high-pressure quality that senior staff tended to manage closely, keeping the residents at the margins. She did not know. But his name did not appear in the conversations she overheard about the fourth floor's most prominent patient. That meant he had less invested in the existing conclusions. She thought about him for 4 days. On the 4th day, she made a decision. Not an impulsive decision. She did not make impulsive decisions. It was a decision that she had tested from multiple angles, that she had held up against every counter-argument she could construct, and that had survived each test not because it was safe, or comfortable, or within the boundaries of what was expected of her, but because the alternative, doing nothing, letting 8 days become 7 and 7 become 6 and the procedure arrive without anyone having looked at what she had seen, was something she could not live with. She was not a hero. She did not think of herself as one, and she was not constructing a narrative in which she was. She was a 34-year-old cleaning worker with a dollar store notebook and 11 years of accumulated invisibility, and a mind that had spent her entire life noticing things that other people missed. She had no authority. She had no credentials. She had no protection. What she had was the notebook, and the timeline, and the knowledge, settled into her chest now like something permanent, that the pattern was real and that no one else in that building had seen it yet. She reorganized the notebook one final time, adding dates and making sure every entry was legible in handwriting that was not hers alone to read. She wrote a single summary page at the front, one side, clear and plain, that laid out the sequence as she understood it, the observations that had generated the suspicion, the research that had given the suspicion structure, and the specific questions she believed needed to be asked, whether Balthazar Quinley Rourke had been given a standard toxicology panel that screened for supplement interactions, and if not, whether one should be ordered before any invasive procedure was undertaken. She held the notebook in both hands and looked at it. Then she put it in her bag, clocked into her shift, and went to find Orenthal Pike Mercer. She found him at 2:30 in the morning, in the small alcove near the 4th-floor stairwell where residents sometimes stood to make phone calls outside of earshot of the nursing station. He was not on the phone. He was leaning against the wall with a paper cup of coffee and the expression of someone mid-thought, somewhere between one task and the next. He looked up when she stopped near the alcove entrance. Not startled, tired. People are rarely startled. They have spent too much energy on everything else, but attentive, waiting. "Dr. Mercer?" she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was careful. Most of them were careful when she initiated conversation. It was outside the script. "My name is Crispinia Harrow. I work nights on this floor. I'm sorry to bother you." "It's okay," he said. Though his expression was asking a question, his words had not yet formed. She held out the notebook. "I need you to look at something," she said. "And I need to tell you up front that I have no medical training, and I understand if you decide this is nothing. But the procedure for the boy in 412 is in 4 days, and I don't think anyone has asked the right question yet." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not dismissal, not the careful institutional caution she had encountered with Perla and Dwayne Ferris. Something more open than that. Something that was still, if only just capable of being surprised. He took the notebook. "Tell me," he said. She did. Orenthal Pike Mercer had wanted to be a doctor since he was 11 years old. Not in the vague, generalized way that children sometimes say they want to be doctors, because it is one of the few professions whose social value is communicated clearly and early, because the adults around them respond to the declaration with a particular quality of approval that makes it feel like the right answer to give. He had wanted it specifically, for a specific reason, rooted in a specific night that he had never fully left behind, the way certain nights attach themselves to a person and travel with them, through every subsequent version of their life. His younger brother Marcus had been 7 when he stopped breathing in the middle of the night. Orenthal had been 11, and he had been the one to find him, and he had been the one to run to his parents' room, and he had stood in the hallway of their house in Milwaukee watching paramedics work with a focused, unhurried efficiency that had struck him even then, even in the middle of the terror of it, as something close to extraordinary. Marcus had survived. The paramedic who had worked on him, a broad-shouldered woman named Celia, who had spoken to Orenthal afterward with the same calm she had brought to everything else that night, had told him that it had been close, but that they had caught it in time. He had thought about Celia many times in the years since. He had thought about what it meant to catch something in time. He had built his entire professional life around that phrase, around the belief that medicine, at its best, was the practice of catching things before they became irreversible, of seeing clearly enough and quickly enough and without ego enough to act before the window closed. He was 28 years old, and he was 7 months into his residency, and the hospital had already begun the slow work of teaching him that catching things in time was more complicated than Celia had made it look. He stood in the alcove near the 4th-floor stairwell and read Crispinia's notebook from the beginning. She had offered to summarize it for him, to walk him through the key entries, to save him time. He had shaken his head. "Let me read it," he said, and she had nodded and stood quietly beside him while he did, which he appreciated more than he could have explained, the fact that she did not fill the silence with reassurances or apologies or additional context he had not asked for. She simply let him read. It took him 14 minutes. He knew because he checked the time when he took the notebook, and again when he lowered it. He had read it the way he read everything, critically, looking for the seams, testing each observation against what he knew and against what he knew he did not know. He looked for the places where her logic jumped too far, where she connected dots that were too distant from each other, where the pattern she was seeing could be explained more simply by variables she had not accounted for. He was rigorous about this in a way that was not skepticism for its own sake, but genuine intellectual honesty, the kind he had been trained to apply to data, to test results, to clinical presentations, and that he was now applying, unexpectedly, at 2:30 in the morning, to the handwritten observations of a cleaning worker who had been paying closer attention than anyone else in the building. He found seams. There were places where the logic stretched. There were entries that could be read multiple ways, observations that were consistent with her theory but were not exclusive to it. They could also be consistent with other explanations. But the core of it held. The timeline held. The correlation between specific nights and specific mornings held. The question she was asking, the one written on the summary page at the front, was a question that he realized, as he read it, that he could not immediately answer. He did not know without checking whether a comprehensive supplement interaction screen had been included in Balthazar's toxicology workup. He knew the case had been managed primarily by the senior attending and the consulting specialists, and he knew that he was not on the case, and he knew what it meant that he was not on the case. He lowered the notebook and looked at her. In the fluorescent light of the alcove, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman at the end of a long night, in a uniform that had seen many such nights, holding herself very straight in the particular way of someone who has prepared carefully for a moment they cannot fully prepare for. She was watching him with an expression that was neither hopeful nor resigned, something more careful than either, something that had already accounted for the possibility that this would go the same way the previous conversations had gone, and had decided to try anyway. "The procedure is in 4 days," she said. Her voice was level. "I know," he said. "If there's an interaction they haven't screened for—" "I know," he said again. He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the notebook in his hands, then back at her. "Can I keep this tonight?" She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The notebook was the only copy of everything she had written. He understood that, and he understood what the hesitation meant, and he respected it. "I need to look some things up," he said. "I'll have it back to you before your shift ends. You have my word." Another fraction of a second. Then she nodded. He took the notebook with him. He spent the next 3 hours in the residence room, which was empty at that hour except for a second year named Priya who was asleep on the narrow couch in the corner with her coat pulled over her shoulders. He sat at the desk in the far corner with his laptop open and Crispinia's notebook beside him and worked through it the way he worked through problems that mattered, methodically, without rushing, allowing each piece of information to settle before moving to the next. He pulled up the publicly available research on the class of supplements she had described. She had not named them specifically in the notebook, but she had described the wrapper detail clearly enough and the interaction profile specifically. Enough that he was able to identify the category within 20 minutes. He read 3 papers. Then he read 2 more. The research was not definitive. It rarely was in this area, because the clinical trials on supplement interactions in pediatric patients were sparse, and the regulatory framework around supplement disclosure was loose enough to drive a hospital system through. But there was enough. There was enough to establish that the interaction she was pointing toward was pharmacologically plausible, that it had been documented in case reports even if it had not been studied systematically, and that its clinical presentation would be consistent, broadly, imperfectly, but genuinely consistent, with what Balthazar Quinley Rourke had been experiencing for the past several weeks. He then looked up the boy's case file. He did not technically have access to it. His credentials allowed him to view records for patients on his assigned cases, and Balthazar was not on his assigned cases. But the hospital's record system had a gap in its permissions architecture that most residents discovered within their first few months, a gap that the administration was aware of and had been meaning to close for some time and had not yet gotten around to closing, and which Orenthal had used twice before, both times for legitimate clinical reasons that he had been careful not to draw attention to. He used it now. He found the toxicology panel that had been ordered at the beginning of Balthazar's admission. It was comprehensive for the presenting symptoms, for what the team had initially suspected. It was not comprehensive for supplement interactions. The specific screen that would identify the compounds he was now looking for had not been ordered because there had been no documented reason to suspect them, because no one had known to look, because the family had not disclosed the supplements, and the clinical team had not asked specifically about them, because the question had never been on the table. Until now. He sat back in his chair. Priya shifted on the couch and made a small sound in her sleep. The computer screen cast a blue-white light across the desk. Outside the narrow window at the far end of the room, the Chicago skyline sat in its nighttime arrangement, enormous and indifferent, the lights of office buildings burning for no one in particular. He thought about what he was looking at. He thought about what it would mean to act on it. If he went to the attending, Dr. Vaughn Ossie, a man of significant reputation and proportionally significant ego, and presented this, he would be a 28-year-old resident with 7 months of experience walking into a senior physician's office and telling him that a woman who cleaned hospital floors had noticed something that 7 specialists had not. He had known Von Ose for 7 months. He had a clear picture of how that conversation would go. If he went to the chief of medicine, he would be circumventing the attending entirely, which was not only politically catastrophic for his residency, but would also guarantee that the conversation would take place in the most defensive, most institution-protective context possible, which was the context least likely to result in a clear-eyed clinical decision. If he did nothing, the procedure would proceed in 4 days. And if Crispinia's notebook was right, if the pattern was what she said it was, if the interaction was what the research suggested it could be, then the procedure would be performed on a patient whose actual underlying problem had not been identified at an additional physiological cost, with unpredictable results. He sat with this for a long time. Then he opened a new document on his laptop and began to write. He returned the notebook to Crispinia at 5:15 in the morning, with 20 minutes left in her shift. He found her in the supply corridor, restocking her cart for the end-of-shift check. She looked up when he approached, and he saw the question in her face before she asked it. "I looked at the research," he said, keeping his voice below the threshold of the nearest nursing station. "I looked at the file." "And?" she said. "The screen they need hasn't been run," he said. "Not for this." He paused. "You understand, I can't tell you what I'm going to do with that. I need to think about it carefully." "I know," she said. She took the notebook from him. "I know you do. What you put together," he said, and stopped. He was not good at this, at the non-clinical part, at the part where the words were about something other than data. "It's thorough. It's more thorough than I expected. I'm not saying that to condescend." "I know you're not," she said. He nodded. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, the pause of 2 people who have looked at the same difficult thing together and are each processing it separately. 4 days, she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." He walked back toward the residence station, and she watched him go, and she felt neither relieved nor reassured. She felt the way she had felt at the beginning, like someone standing at the edge of something very large, unable to see the bottom, having done the only thing available to her and now waiting to find out whether it had been enough. The next 2 days were among the hardest she could remember, not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. The floor continued its regular rhythm. Balthazar remained in room 412. The procedure remained scheduled. Eldrick Rourke was present during visiting hours with the contained, pressurized energy of a man who had decided that forward motion was the only acceptable response to fear. His wife, Crispinia, had seen her only 3 times over the entire course of the boy's hospitalization, came once, stayed for an hour, and left with the expression of someone who had been asked to feel something they did not know how to feel. Crispinia worked her shift. She cleaned her rooms. She pushed her cart through the corridors and said nothing to anyone. She added entries to the notebook even though there was nothing new to add. She wrote the date and the time and no change and closed it again. It was a way of maintaining the record, of keeping the practice of attention alive even when there was nothing for it to catch. On the morning of the 2nd day, she received a text from Dulcie. They said yes, full scholarship. She sat on the bus with the phone in both hands and felt something move through her chest. Something warm and large and almost too big to contain, the particular joy of a good thing happening to someone you love, the best kind of vicarious pleasure. She wrote back, "I knew they would. I'm so proud of you." And then she added a string of hearts because Dulcie was 17 and deserved hearts, and because Crispinia was 34 and had earned the right to send them without embarrassment. She tucked the phone into her bag and looked out the window at Chicago, passing by in the gray December light, and thought, whatever happens next, that happened. That is real, and it happened, and it cannot be taken back. She held on to that. The procedure was moved up by a day. She found out at the beginning of her shift on what should have been the 3rd day, the evening before the original scheduled date, when she overheard 2 nurses in the hallway discussing the change. The boys' numbers had shifted again. The attending had decided that waiting the additional day introduced unnecessary risk, The procedure was now scheduled for 6 in the morning. It was 10:15 at night. She stood in the hallway for a moment after the nurses moved on, very still, her hand resting on the handle of her cart. 6 in the morning. Her shift ended at 6. She did the calculation automatically, without choosing to, 7 hours and 45 minutes. She pulled out the notebook, she wrote the time and the information, and then she stood there with the pen in her hand and did not write anything else because there was nothing else to write. The situation had just become something different. It had become a problem with a deadline, and the deadline was the length of her remaining shift, and the action required before that deadline was not hers to take. It was Orenthal Pike Mercer's. She did not know what he had decided. She had not seen him in 2 days. She had told herself not to seek him out, that she had given him what she had to give, that the rest of it was his to carry, that pushing further would undermine whatever fragile credibility her notebook had established. She had kept to that. It had cost her, in the accumulated sleepless arithmetic of 2 nights, more than she had expected. She found him at 11 in the evening, by accident, coming out of the stairwell as she was passing it. He looked like he had not slept. She suspected she looked the same. He saw her face before she said anything. "I heard," he said. "They moved it to 6. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she had not seen from him before, a crack in the composure. "I filed a request for an additional panel, through proper channels, yesterday morning." She waited. "It was reviewed and declined," he said. "Not enough clinical justification from a resident not on the case. Vaughn Osei's team is managing the pre-procedure workup. They've determined the patient is ready." He said it in a flat, careful voice that was doing a great deal of work to stay flat and careful. "So the request was denied," she said. "Yes." She absorbed this. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the stairwell light, he looked younger than 28 and older than 28 at the same time, the particular combination that belongs to people who are standing at the edge of a decision they cannot take back. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest thing he could have said. She recognized it as such. 5 hours and 45 minutes, she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She nodded once. Then she pushed her cart down the hallway, and she did not look back, because looking back would not have helped either of them. At 4 in the morning, she was cleaning the family waiting area near the elevator bank when she heard footsteps behind her moving with a different quality than the usual nighttime pace. Faster, more deliberate, carrying the specific weight of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it before they can unmake it. She turned. Orenthal Pike Mercer was walking toward the nurse's station with a folder in his hand, and the expression of a man who has just stepped off a ledge and is currently suspended in the moment before gravity finishes its work. She watched him speak to the charge nurse. She watched the charge nurse's expression shift, first neutral, then confused, then something more guarded. She watched Orenthal gesture toward the folder. She was too far away to hear the words. She turned back to her cart and continued cleaning. Her hands were steady. She did not know why they were steady. She had expected them not to be. She cleaned the waiting area and moved to the next section of the hallway and kept moving, because moving was the only thing available to her, and because the next hour and 50 minutes would happen regardless of whether she was still or moving, and moving at least gave her something to do with the part of herself that wanted desperately to know what was happening around the corner. At 5:47, she checked the time and turned her cart toward the elevator, and then stopped. Down the corridor, she could see the door of room 412 and the cluster of people near it. Nurses, someone in scrubs who was part of the procedure preparation team, and Orenthal Pike Mercer, standing slightly apart from the others with the folder still in his hand and his voice raised just enough to reach her from that distance. Not in anger, but in the particular controlled urgency of someone making the most important argument of their life to someone who has not yet decided to listen. She thought about continuing to the elevator. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then, she walked toward room 412. The hallway outside room 412 at 5:47 in the morning had the particular quality of a held breath. Not silence. It was never fully silent on a hospital floor, even at that hour. There was always the ambient sound of the building doing what buildings do, the hum of ventilation systems, the distant beep of monitors, the soft percussion of footsteps on linoleum from somewhere further down the corridor. But those sounds had retreated to the background, the way background sounds do when something in the foreground demands total attention. And what occupied the foreground now was a 28-year-old resident standing in the middle of a hallway with a folder pressed against his chest and the contained, precise voice of someone who has decided that controlled clarity is the only weapon available to him. Crispinia stopped her cart at the edge of the cluster and stood very still. There were 6 people in the immediate area. 2 nurses she recognized, Perla Oduya, who would not meet her eyes, and a senior nurse from the procedure preparation team whose name she did not know. A technician from the interventional unit who was checking equipment with the professional. Detachment of someone who was waiting for the administrative conversation to conclude so the clinical work could begin. A man in a gray suit who she understood, from his positioning and his expression, to be someone from hospital administration, not clinical staff, but the kind of presence that appeared when institutional interests required representation. And Dr. Von Osei, the attending, who had arrived with the precise quality of controlled authority that Crispinia had observed in him from a distance on multiple occasions, and who was now directing that authority at Orenthal Pike. Mercer with the focused intensity of a man who considers interruption a form of personal insult. Dr. Mercer, Osei said, in the tone of someone repeating themselves for what they intend to be the final time. This procedure has been authorized. The patient has been assessed and cleared by the full consulting team. You are not on this case. You do not have standing to... I'm asking for 30 minutes, Orenthal said. His voice did not shake. Crispinia noted this with something she recognized as relief, and then recognized the relief and understood what it meant, that she had been more invested in this outcome than she had permitted herself to consciously acknowledge. 30 minutes to run one additional panel. If the results are negative, the procedure proceeds on schedule. Nothing is lost except 30 minutes. The procedure is scheduled for 6 o'clock, Osei said. The family has been informed. The team is ready. You are asking me to delay a medically authorized intervention based on... He looked down at the folder with an expression that did not quite become contempt, but came close. Based on notes assembled by a member of the housekeeping staff. The word housekeeping landed in the hallway like a stone dropped from a height. Crispinia did not move. She kept her hands on the cart handle and her face neutral and her breathing even, because she had been in enough rooms and enough hallways and enough conversations where her presence was being used as a dismissal, and she had learned, slowly, over years, at considerable cost, that the most effective response to being used as a dismissal was to remain present and undismissed. The notes identify a specific pharmacological interaction, Orenthal said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Not louder, but more deliberate, the way a person speaks when they are choosing each word with surgical precision. An interaction that has clinical precedent in the literature. An interaction that would not appear in the panels we have already run. I am asking for one additional test, not a revision of the diagnosis, not a cancellation of the procedure. One test, 30 minutes before we proceed. You filed a formal request yesterday morning, the man in the gray suit said. His voice had the particular quality of someone whose primary concern is documentation. That request was reviewed and declined through appropriate channels. Yes, Orenthal said. It was. Then this conversation is happening anyway, Orenthal said, because the procedure is in 13 minutes, and I am not able to allow it to proceed without saying this directly to the people who are going to make this decision in this hallway, right now. A pause. Osei looked at him with an expression that had moved past irritation into something more complex. Something that contained, Crispinia thought, a trace of reluctant attention beneath the institutional offense. He was a careful man. She had observed that from a distance, and she observed it now up close. Careful men did not always do the right thing, but they did tend to actually hear arguments before dismissing them, which was more than some. Show me, Osei said. Orenthal opened the folder. He had organized it. Crispinia could see this from where she stood, with the same methodical care she had used in the notebook, but translated into a clinical register that the audience in this hallway could receive. Her observations were there, but they had been cross-referenced with the research he had pulled, with the specific pharmacological literature on the interaction class, with a clear and annotated timeline that mapped the clinical record against the pattern she had identified. He had spent those missing 2 days doing exactly this, not just reviewing what she had given him, but building the case that could be presented to people who would not and could not accept the notebook on its own terms. He walked Osei through it in 4 minutes. Not the full document. He had prepared a summary page, the way she had prepared a summary page, understanding instinctively that the audience for this conversation had limited time and would not extend that time unless the summary compelled them to. Osei read. His face was difficult to read, deliberately so, she thought. The kind of face that had learned to remain neutral during the processing of information, because showing your reactions too early gives the other person too much. The man in the gray suit looked at his watch. Once. Then he looked at Osei. The procedure technician had stopped checking equipment. He was looking at the floor. Perla Oduya was looking at Crispinia, not with the careful institutional look she had used during their previous conversation. Something different. Something that was still processing. The specific compound you're suggesting, Osei said slowly, still looking at the summary page. The interaction profile. He paused. This is documented? Pages 4 through 7, Orenthal said. 3 peer-reviewed case reports and 1 retrospective analysis. Pediatric populations. The clinical presentation in all 4 cases was... I can read, Osei said. Not unkindly. He turned to page 4. He read for 90 seconds. He turned to page 5. The hallway held its breath. Crispinia watched his face and waited for the moment. The small, involuntary shift that happens when a careful mind encounters information it cannot immediately dismiss. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not announce itself. It was a fractional thing, a barely visible recalibration behind the eyes, the kind of thing she had spent years learning to identify in people who were deciding whether to let a piece of information in. She saw it. Osei closed the folder. He looked at the man in the gray suit. Then he looked at the procedure technician. Then he looked at the door of room 412 and was quiet for a moment that felt, in that hallway, considerably longer than it was. Delay the prep, he said. What happened in the next 40 minutes did not resemble the dramatic reconstructions that such moments tend to generate in the retelling. There was no argument won, no applause, no visible recognition of the thing that had just been set in motion. Osei gave a series of quiet, specific instructions to the nursing staff, ordered the additional panel with a brevity that suggested he had already moved past the decision into the logistics of executing it, and disappeared into the room to speak with the patient and, shortly afterward, with the family. The technician from the procedure team made a call on his phone and stood in the hallway with the contained patience of someone accustomed to delays. The man in the gray suit walked toward the elevator with the expression of a man composing an incident report in his head. Orenthal stood in the hallway with his folder and looked, for the first time since she had known him, like someone who had just set down a very heavy thing and was not yet sure how to stand without it. Crispinia pushed her cart to the end of the corridor and stood at the window. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did in December, existing under a flat gray sky with the particular stoic persistence of a city that has been cold before and expects to be cold again, and has made its peace with this. The parking lot below was filling slowly as the day shift began to arrive. A man in a heavy coat crossed the lot, at a diagonal, moving quickly, his breath visible in the cold air. She looked at the clock on the wall above the nursing station. 6:04. Her shift had technically ended 4 minutes ago. She stayed. The results came back at 6:51 in the morning. She knew this not because anyone told her. No one told her anything, because she was not part of the clinical team, and her shift was over, and her formal connection to what was happening in room 412 was non-existent. She knew because she was still in the hallway, sitting in one of the chairs near the supply corridor with her jacket on and her bag in her lap, and because she had spent enough time in that building to read its rhythms accurately enough to know when something had shifted. The shift happened at 6:51. She heard it first in the quality of movement near the nursing station. A different pace, a different register of voices. Then she saw O.C. emerge from a room down the corridor and walk toward the station with the particular stride of someone moving toward a decision rather than away from one. Then she saw Orenthal, coming from the opposite direction, and saw the moment when O.C. stopped him in the hallway. She could not hear what was said. She did not need to. She watched O.C.'s face. She watched the absence of dismissal in it. She watched the small, precise nod that O.C. gave. Not concession, not apology, not any of the larger gestures that the situation might have seemed to call for, but a nod. The nod of a careful man, acknowledging a piece of information that has proven valid. Orenthal said something. O.C. responded. The conversation lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then O.C. walked back in the direction he had come from, and Orenthal stood in the hallway for a moment by himself, and Crispina watched his shoulders do something she had not seen them do in all the time she had observed him. They dropped, not in defeat, in release, in the particular physical expression of a weight being lifted from a place where it has been carried for a very long time. He turned and saw her. He walked to where she was sitting, and stood in front of her and did not immediately say anything, which she appreciated. She had not stood up. The panel identified elevated levels consistent with the interaction profile, he said, quietly, in the voice he used for clinical information. Factual, clean, specific. They're adjusting the treatment protocol. The procedure has been postponed pending reassessment. She nodded. You were right, he said. And then, because he was a person of genuine precision. About the question you asked was right. The question turned out to have a right answer. How is he? She asked. He'll need time, Orenthal said. The adjustment won't be immediate. But if the team is treating the actual problem now, he stopped. Yes, he should be okay. She nodded again. They sat in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together that they will not be able to fully explain to anyone who was not there, and who understand that the thing they have been through is not over, that it has, in some ways, just begun, that the portion of it that involves consequences and reckonings and institutional responses is still ahead of them, and that neither of them can fully protect the other from those things. What happens now? She asked. For herself, she meant. She thought he understood. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. And then, because he was also a person of genuine honesty, I think there will be an investigation, internal, into the protocol breach, into how I access the records. He paused. Into you, why you were in that hallway, what authorization you had. None, she said. I had none. I know. I wasn't supposed to be there. No, he said. Neither was I, technically. He looked down at the folder still in his hands. The right thing and the permitted thing weren't the same thing. I've been thinking about that a lot. So have I, she said. Eldrick Rourke arrived at 7:30 in the morning. Crispina was still in the hallway. She was aware, in the back of her mind, that she had now been in the hospital for 9.5 hours and that this was going to require an explanation she did not yet have, but the explanation could wait. She watched him come off the elevator in his expensive coat, moving with the compressed energy he always carried, and she watched the moment when he encountered the attending in the hallway and understood from Ose's expression that something had changed. She watched his face. It was a complicated face to watch. The initial reaction was not what she might have expected, not relief, not gratitude, not the open expansion of a man who has just learned that his son is going to be okay. It was something more guarded than that, something that was already calculating, already thinking about the shape of the narrative that was going to emerge from this morning and how to position himself within it. She thought about what Marta had said on the phone. Find one who would listen. She thought about the research she had done in the public library on 2 consecutive Saturday afternoons. She thought about the cloth bag on the windowsill, appearing and disappearing, and about a father who had believed he was helping and had not understood what he was doing, and about the difference between intention and outcome, which was one of the oldest and most complicated differences in the world. She did not know what Eldrick Rourke had intended. She was not inside his mind, and she did not pretend to be. She knew only what she had observed, what she had recorded, and what the panel results had confirmed about the interaction between what the hospital had been administering and what had been introduced without the hospital's knowledge. Whether he had known what the supplements would do, whether it was negligence or something darker, was not a question she could answer. It was a question for people with more authority and more access than she had. She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The floor supervisor's name was Gwendolyn Marsh, and she had been supervising the night cleaning staff at that hospital for 9 years, and she was a woman of considerable practical intelligence and very limited tolerance for situations that created paperwork. She called Crispinia into her office at 8:15 in the morning, by which point Crispinia had been awake for 26 hours and was running on the particular form of clarity that extreme tiredness sometimes produces, where everything is very sharp and very simple, and the usual background noise of anxiety has gone quiet because the body has run out of resources to maintain it. The conversation was brief. Gwendolyn told her that her presence in the hallway outside room 412 after the end of her shift had been noted, that her interaction with a member of the medical staff, which had been documented in Dr. Mercer's internal report, which she had apparently filed at 4 a.m., had been flagged by administration as a protocol concern, that the nature of the material she had provided to Dr. Mercer raised questions about patient privacy, about the scope of her role, and about the appropriate boundaries between clinical and non-clinical staff. Crispinia listened to all of this without interrupting. When Gwendolyn finished, there was a pause. "Is there anything you want to say?" Gwendolyn asked. Crispinia thought about this carefully. She thought about all the things she could say, the timeline, the research, the conversation she had tried to have with Perla Oduya, the conversation she had tried to have with Dwayne Ferris, the 11 pages in the notebook, the 6:51 panel results, the small sound she had heard through the door of room 412 on a Tuesday night in late October that had started all of it. "No," she said. "I don't think so." Gwendolyn nodded. She looked at Crispinia with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not unkind, but not warm either. The expression of a person who is operating within a structure that is larger than her individual feelings about a situation. "You'll receive written notice by end of week," she said. Crispinia nodded. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out of the office. She rode the bus home. In the gray December morning, the city moved past the window in its usual way. The same streets, the same buildings, the same overcast sky pressing down on everything. A woman across the aisle was reading something on her phone. A man near the front was asleep. 2 teenagers at the back were sharing earphones and laughing at something neither of them could explain to anyone outside the specific frequency of their particular friendship. Crispinia held her bag in her lap and looked out the window. She thought about Balthazar Quinley Rourke, 9 years old, in a room on the 4th floor, beginning the slow work of being treated for the thing that had actually been wrong with him. She thought about how long that would take, and whether it would be enough, and how many versions of okay there were, and which one he might get. She thought about Orenthal Pike Mercer, who was going to face an investigation, whose residency was going to be complicated by what he had done this morning, who had taken the notebook from her hands at 2:30 in the morning and said, "Tell me," and meant it. She thought about Dulcie, who had a full scholarship. She thought about the notebook, still in her bag. 11 pages and a summary and 3 asterisks on the last entry, and the question she had written in slightly larger letters. What if the problem isn't what they're giving him, but what they don't know they're giving him? The answer, it turned out, had been exactly that. The bus reached her stop. She got off into the cold air and walked the 4 blocks to her building and climbed the 2 flights of stairs and opened the door to the apartment, where Dulcie was still asleep, the scholarship letter printed and placed carefully on the kitchen table as if it needed to be visible to be real. Crispinia sat down at the table beside it. She sat there for a long time, in the quiet of the morning, in the particular stillness of a person who has done what they came to do and is now on the other side of it, learning what the other side feels like. It felt, she thought, like the cold morning air, like something you could not quite get warm from right away, like something that was true regardless of whether it was comfortable. She folded her hands on the table. Outside, Chicago continued in its December way, indifferent, enormous, full of people carrying things that no one else could. See, she closed her eyes. The letter arrived on a Friday. Crispinia had known it was coming. Gwendolyn Marsh had told her it would arrive by end of week, and Gwendolyn Marsh was, whatever else she was, a woman of her word. Still, there is a difference between knowing a thing is coming and holding it in your hands, and Crispinia sat at the kitchen table for a moment before opening it, the envelope resting flat in front of her, the hospital's logo printed in the upper left corner in the particular shade of blue that institutions choose when they want to appear trustworthy. She opened it. The language was careful and impersonal in the way that institutional language always is when institutions are protecting themselves, measured, passive, stripped of anything that could be interpreted as admission or accusation. It cited violations of patient privacy protocols. It cited unauthorized access to restricted areas outside of scheduled duties. It cited conduct inconsistent with the scope of her role. It thanked her for her 3 years of service. It informed her that her final paycheck would be processed within 10 business days. It did not mention Balthazar Quinley Rourke. It did not mention the notebook. It did not mention the panel results. It did not mention what had been found or what had been adjusted or what had been, by any reasonable accounting, prevented. It was 4 paragraphs long, and it contained, in 4 paragraphs, everything the hospital intended to say about the matter and nothing that it did not. She folded it along its original crease and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the table beside the sugar bowl. Then she got up and made coffee, and while the coffee was brewing, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the street below, where a woman was walking a small dog with the particular purposeful inefficiency that small dogs impose on their owners, stopping every few feet to investigate something invisible to everyone else, and the woman following with patient, unhurried steps, allowing the investigation, going at the pace the small dog required. Crispinia watched them until they turned the corner and were gone. Then she poured her coffee and sat back down at the table and thought about what came next. Dulcie found the letter that evening. She had come home from school with the particular energy of a person whose future has recently clarified itself, lighter, more forward-facing, the scholarship having lifted something from her that she had been carrying for longer than either of them had fully acknowledged. She dropped her backpack by the door, saw the envelope on the table, and picked it up before Crispinia could decide how to introduce the subject. She read it. Crispinia watched her face move through understanding. When she looked up, her expression was complicated. Not the simple distress of a teenager encountering bad news, but something more layered. The expression of a person who is old enough to understand that situations can be right and wrong at the same time, that the world does not always organize its outcomes according to the logic of fairness, and that understanding this does not make it hurt less. "They fired you," she said. "Yes," Crispinia said, "because of the boy. Because of the protocols I violated," Crispinia said, because precision mattered to her, even now, even in this. "I did violate them. That part is accurate." Dulcie set the letter down. "Is he okay? The boy?" "I don't know," Crispinia said. "I think so. I hope so." Dulcie was quiet for a moment. She sat down across from her sister and folded her hands on the table in a gesture so similar to one of Crispinia's own that it stopped the breath briefly in Crispinia's chest. "What are you going to do?" "Find another job," Crispinia said. "That's what I'm going to do." "I could defer the scholarship," Dulcie said. "1 year. I could work and—" "No," Crispinia said, quietly, clearly, with the particular gentleness that is available only when you are completely certain. "No, you will not defer anything. This is not your problem to solve. You're my sister." "Yes," Crispinia said, "and you have a full scholarship. And your job right now is to use it. That's all." Dulcie looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and covered Crispinia's folded hands with both of hers, a gesture that was so like something their mother used to do that it moved through Crispinia like a current, quiet and deep, gone, as quickly as it came. "You did the right thing," Dulcie said. Crispinia looked at their hands on the table. "I know," she said. "It doesn't always feel like very much." "It is, though," Dulcie said. "It really is." The investigation into Orenthal Pike Mercer began the following Monday. Crispinia did not learn the details of it directly. She was no longer employed at the hospital and had no access to its internal proceedings. She learned what she learned through the indirect channels that had always been her primary source of information about things that were not officially communicated to her. A brief conversation with a former coworker she ran into at the bus stop 2 weeks later, a fragment overheard, old habits, old reflexes, when she returned to the hospital in January to collect a personal item she had left in the locker room. What she understood was this: Orenthal had been placed on a supervised rotation, his caseload reduced, his access to patient records more closely monitored. The internal review had acknowledged, in language that was characteristically institutional in its evasiveness, that the panel results had been clinically significant, and that the treatment adjustment had been appropriate. It had also acknowledged, in equally careful language, that the method by which the concern had been raised represented a violation of established protocols, and that the resident's decision to access records outside his assigned cases was a serious matter requiring formal review. The review did not conclude that he had been wrong. It concluded that he had been out of bounds. These were treated, in the institutional record, as equivalent concerns. She thought about this for a while. She thought about the distinction between wrong and out of bounds, about what it meant that a system could acknowledge the validity of an outcome while simultaneously penalizing the process that produced it. She was not naive enough to be surprised by this, but she was honest enough to be troubled by it, which was different from surprise and, she thought, more important. She sent him a text message. She had his number from the exchange that had happened during those 2 days between their conversation in the stairwell and the morning of the procedure. She had not used it before. She used it now. "I heard there's an investigation. I'm sorry it came to that," he responded. Within a few minutes. "Don't be. I knew what I was doing. Hope you're okay." She looked at that message for a moment. Then she typed, "Getting there. Take care of yourself." He wrote back, "You too." That was the last time they communicated directly. January was hard in the way that January in Chicago is. Hard, physically, persistently, without the novelty of the first cold months to soften it. The kind of cold that has been cold for long enough that you can no longer remember warmth as a sensory experience, only as a concept. Crispinia spent the first 2 weeks after her termination doing what she had always done when the ground shifted beneath her. She made a list. Not a dramatic list, not a list accompanied by crisis or self-pity, but a practical, specific, prioritized list of what needed to happen and in what order. She listed her expenses, her savings, which were modest but present, because she had always lived slightly below her means precisely to have something available for moments like this one, and the amount of time she could sustain the current situation without additional income. She gave herself 6 weeks. That was the number the list produced when she ran it. Honestly. Then she spent the next 3 weeks applying for jobs. She was methodical about this too. She applied broadly within healthcare facilities, not because she felt a particular loyalty to the sector after what had happened, but because her experience was there and her references were there. And starting over entirely would cost time she did not have. She applied to 2 hospitals on the north side, 1 clinical office complex, a long-term care facility in Berwyn, and a large hotel downtown that had posted a housekeeping supervisor position that her experience made her qualified for. The long-term care facility in Berwyn called her first. The interview was conducted by a woman named Rosario, who was direct in the way of people who have been hiring for a long time and have stopped finding value in indirection. She asked Crispinia why she had left her previous position. Crispinia told her the truth, that she had been dismissed for violating protocols. She did not elaborate beyond this. Rosario asked her, with a straightforwardness that Crispinia appreciated, whether she was likely to violate protocols again. Crispinia thought about this question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I think I would try harder to work within the system first," she said. "I did try. I'm not sure the outcome would have been different if I had tried differently, but I would try harder." Rosario looked at her for a moment. "That's an honest answer," she said. "It's the accurate one," Crispinia said. She started at the Berwyn facility 3 weeks later. The pay was slightly less than what she had been making. The commute was longer. The facility itself was smaller and quieter, an environment of slower rhythms and longer relationships, where the residents were not passing through on their way to recovery, but were, in many cases, in the place where the last chapter of their lives was being written. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mind it, that there was something in the pace of it, in the particular quality of attention that long-term care required, that suited something in her. She noticed things there too, patterns, details, the small communications of people who could not always communicate directly. She brought her notebook, which had become, by now, a practice rather than an object. She had started a new one, a slightly better quality than the dollar store version, a small private acknowledgement of the value of the practice. She did not tell anyone at the Berwyn facility about what had happened at the hospital. It was not a story she told. In February, the hospital issued a press release. She found it by accident, 3 days after it was published, when a former coworker shared it in a group chat that Crispinia was still technically a member of. The release announced that Hartwell Medical Center, the full name of the hospital that had been for 3 years simply the hospital in Crispinia's internal accounting, had implemented new clinical protocols for supplement interaction screening in pediatric cases. It described this as part of the hospital's ongoing commitment to comprehensive patient care and evidence-based practice. It cited a recent case, anonymized, referred to only as a complex pediatrics presentation, as having prompted a review that led to the new protocols. It did not mention Crispinia Valletta Harrow. It did not mention Orenthal Pike Mercer. It did not mention a notebook, or a hallway at 5:47 in the morning, or a conversation in an alcove near the stairwell, or a request that was declined through proper channels, or a decision that had placed a young doctor's career in jeopardy. It mentioned, in the final paragraph, the hospital's gratitude to its clinical team for their dedication to patient outcomes. She read the press release twice. Then she closed the group chat and put her phone in her bag. She was on her lunch break at the Berwyn facility, sitting in the small staff room with a sandwich she had made that morning. Through the window, she could see the facility's garden. Not much to see in February, mostly bare branches and gray sky, but there was a bird feeder attached to a pole near the center of the garden, and a single cardinal had found it and was eating with the focused, unself-conscious efficiency of something that is very good at being exactly what it is. She watched the cardinal for a while. She thought about what it meant that the protocols had changed. That somewhere in the procedural infrastructure of a hospital, there was now a question that had not been there before. A specific clinical question about supplement interactions in pediatric cases. And that the question was there because of what she had seen and written and refused to stop pursuing, even when pursuing it had cost her the job that paid her rent and the rent that kept a roof over her and Dulcie's heads. The protocols had changed. Balthazar Quinley Rourke, whose name she would never see in any press release, had, as far as she could determine from the fragments available to her, recovered. She had heard this secondhand, through the same winding channels that had always carried information to her. Recovered slowly, not without difficulty, but recovered. The cardinal finished eating and flew away. Crispinia finished her sandwich and went back to work. Eldrick Rourke issued no public statement. This she had also expected. Men with his resources and his legal team did not issue public statements about situations they had not been formally charged with anything in connection with. The hospital's narrative, a complex clinical case, new protocols, implemented, outcomes positive, was a narrative that served his interests as much as it served the institution's, and she understood, without cynicism or surprise, that narratives which serve powerful interests tend to be the ones that take hold. There was no investigation into what he had brought into that room in a small cloth bag. There was no formal documentation of the supplement, no recorded conversation about the interaction, no process that bore his name or assigned him responsibility for the months of his son's suffering, and the near implementation of a procedure that had been based on an incomplete picture. If there had been conversations between his lawyers and the hospital's lawyers, between people operating in rooms she would never have access to, she would never know what had been said or agreed upon or quietly settled. She thought about this for a while. In the evenings when the apartment was quiet, and Dulcie was studying, and the space allowed for the kind of thinking that the daytime did not. She thought about whether it made her angry. It did. She was honest about that. because she was always honest about what she actually felt, which she considered a form of basic self-respect. It made her angry in the way that true things make you angry. Not the hot, reactive anger of surprise, but the slower, more durable anger of recognition. The anger of seeing something clearly and understanding that seeing it clearly does not change it. She held the anger without being consumed by it, which was a skill she had developed over years and which she considered privately one of the more important things she had ever learned. And alongside the anger, she held something else. The knowledge, not the hope, the knowledge, that a 9-year-old boy was alive and recovering and had been correctly treated because she had paid attention on a Tuesday night in late October and had not stopped paying attention when everyone around her told her to. That was hers. No press release could take it. No termination letter could reach it. No institutional narrative could revise it or contain it or shape it into something other than what it was. It was hers, and it was real, and it was enough. On a Saturday in March, Crispinia took Dulcie to the public library. Not because either of them needed anything from the library on that particular Saturday. Dulcie had access to the university library now, which was considerably better resourced than the branch near their apartment, and Crispinia's research needs at the moment were limited to the occasional practical question that the internet handled adequately. She took her because the library had been, in those 2 Saturday afternoons in November, the place where a vague and troubled pattern had become something she could hold in her hands and bring to someone who could act on it, and she wanted to walk through the door of that place with her sister, who knew the shape of the story if not all of its details, and to sit at one of the tables in the afternoon light. They sat for 2 hours. Dulcie read something for a class. Crispinia read a novel, something she rarely allowed herself the time for, a habit she was trying to rebuild in the small, deliberate way that she rebuilt most things. At one point, Dulcie looked up from her reading and said, without any particular preamble, "Do you wish it had gone differently?" Crispinia thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Some of it," she said. "I wish I hadn't had to do it alone. I wish the system had made it possible to do it differently." She paused. "But the part that mattered, no, I don't wish that had gone differently." Dulcie nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already believed. "Mom would have done the same thing," she said. Crispinia looked at her sister. At the scholarship, a letter that had lived on the kitchen table for a week before being carefully filed. At the 17 years of a person who had grown up watching someone carry more than they should have to carry without ever putting it down, and who had absorbed something from that watching. "Maybe," Crispinia said. "Yes, probably." They walked home through the March afternoon, which had the particular quality of early Chicago spring, not warm yet, not quite, but edged with something that was not quite cold either, something that was beginning to think about becoming something else. The light was different from the winter light, lower, warmer toned, arriving at a different angle, making familiar streets look briefly like somewhere worth seeing for the first time. Crispinia walked with her hands in her pockets, and her shoulders level, and her face turned toward the direction they were going. She was 34 years old. She worked nights at a long-term care facility in Berwyn. She had a notebook in her jacket pocket, and a sister with a scholarship, and an anger she was learning to carry without being carried by it, and a knowledge that was hers alone and permanent. She was not a hero. The story, had not required her to be. It had required only that she pay attention, and write it down, and refuse to stop, and accept the cost of not stopping, and go on. She went on. Some stories don't end with recognition. They end with something quieter and more durable, the knowledge that the right thing was done by the right person at the right moment, regardless of what the record shows. Crispinia Valletta Harrow's name does not appear in any hospital report. It does not appear in the press release. It is not on any plaque. The protocols changed. The boy lived. She knows. Before you go, if this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in that hallway at 5:47 in the morning, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from today? Whether you're in Florida or Texas, California or New York, Tennessee or somewhere in between. We want to know where our community is, because knowing you're out there is what keeps these stories coming. and we want to know what you think. Did Crispinia make the right choice? Would you have done the same thing, knowing what it would cost? There's no wrong answer, just real people thinking about a real kind of situation, and your perspective matters to us more than you know. If you're new here and this is the first story you've watched with us, please consider subscribing. It takes just a moment, and it makes an enormous difference to a small channel trying to bring honest, grounded, human stories to people who are looking for exactly that. Every subscription tells us that what we're doing is worth continuing, and it is, because of you. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves out there.